problem tonight is that I know too much. And by that I mean that I used to be a professor, and so I've been to many academic seminars, and a great many of them took the same basic form. The speaker would have about an hour to talk, so he'd spend 15 minutes just kind of muttering about how he got interested in the topic. And then he would spend about 45 minutes doing calculus on the board and correcting the calculus mistakes he made as he went along, and drawing really ugly graphs, and being interrupted so frequently by the faculty at the seminar that no one could tell what the train of thought was. And then finally he would kind of get around to drawing his conclusions, which were never that earth-shattering, I have to say. So the point is that you know, these kinds of talks don't try to do too much. They're trying to get to one little point that doesn't amount to much in the first place. Now, what I'm trying to do tonight is quite different, because my real topic is a comparison of the Great Depression and the current economic troubles. And that's a gigantic subject. Just talking about the Great Depression, I could give you all a course, easily give you a course, and give you two if you could sit still for it. So there's a lot going on in these big events, and I'm going to have to be very selective in what I say tonight. And I don't want to bore you by just going over extremely familiar ground. I'm going to presume that you've all heard of the Great Depression, and that you're aware that there are some economic troubles in the world right now. So I'll take that as a given, and try to talk to you at a level that doesn't talk down to you. At the same time, I don't want to go too far ahead of those of you who haven't devoted a lot of time to these subjects. The Great Depression began in the middle of 1929, if we think of it in terms of when national output in the United States reached a peak and began to decline. Most people think of it as beginning in October, when the stock market crashed, and very often they think of that stock market crash as a kind of cause and effect thing. The stock market crash causes all the suffering that follows in the next 11 or 12 years. That's perhaps not entirely wrong. There's at least an argument that can be made for that, but most economists don't think of the stock crash in itself as so much a cause as a kind of advanced signal that troubles were lying ahead. But what I want to do is go through several different aspects of these two times of economic difficulty, not just for the United States, of course. These are difficulties that extend over large parts of the world, especially the most advanced economic parts of the world. So there is that international element that's important. I'm not going to say too much about anything other than the United States, because that's a big topic in its own right. So I want to sort of compare and contrast these two grand events. It's kind of strange to call each one of them an event. Each one is a kind of complex of events, many interrelated. And I'll speak first about the lead up to these troubles, and then the bust, the government measures that were taken in response to them, and then say a little bit about what you might call the ebb and flow of these drawn out periods of kind of economic ailment and political cure going back and forth, and finally say a little bit about something I call regime uncertainty, which is an important upshot of the government's measures to deal with the Great Depression, and perhaps a significant upshot of the present government's anti-recession and anti-financial debacle measures as well. So let's see if I can plow through some of these things and say something sensible. There are some similarities. In fact, I've been struck by the fact that a number of people, journalists and others, in the last year or year and a half have been drawn to these similarities. I don't think it's been the case before in any of the economic downturns of the post-World War II period that a lot of people have rushed to see similarities between what was happening and the Great Depression. But this time, quite a number of people have done that. And when I first began to notice it, I was shocked. My immediate reaction was, what idiots. They're comparing what's going on now with the Great Depression. That was so much more horrible and so much bigger and longer lasting and devastating and consequential and all the rest of it that surely they can't be serious. And I think some of them weren't serious. They were tendentious, and they were using this talk in order to try to sell some kind of policy they had in mind to the government or to the people who look to the government. But the more I thought about it, the more I've come to see that there are some interesting and possibly important similarities between these two economic debacles. And by drawing out these similarities, I don't want to give you the impression that I really believe they're fully comparable. I still don't. I think practically anybody would be much happier living through our current troubles than he would have been living through the troubles of the 1930s. But however that may be, let's see what some of the similarities are. First off, unlike most modern macroeconomists, I don't think the story of these troubles begins the day the economy turns down. There are a lot of events that happened beforehand, and in the case of the Great Depression, many of these events cannot be understood fully unless we go all the way back to World War I. Because World War I altered the economic and political and institutional setup of the advanced economic world. For 100 years before that, the world, the advanced world, had enjoyed a period of relative peace, growing division of labor, growing international trade, technological progress, and rising incomes for the masses of people. You may have gone to school somewhere where they taught you about the horrors of industrialization. Well, that doesn't mean there were no horrors. I'm not going to poo-poo the idea. Life was very difficult for many people in the 19th century, without a doubt. But at the same time, life has always been difficult for people throughout history. So the thing that really makes the 19th century unusual is not that a lot of people had hard lives, but that so many millions of people had lives that weren't so hard as the lives of their ancestors. That economic progress was occurring on a scale which actually affected the masses. There had always been very wealthy people in a lot of societies that lived well, although eventually even those at the top of the heap could be seen to have lived worse than ordinary people came to be able to live after a lot of economic progress had taken place. But in any event, the 19th century saw a great deal of economic progress, and it had much to do with the spread of institutions like secure private property rights, international trade, specialization, technological progress, and a lot of things that were interrelated. And the United States was in the forefront of these developments. And the level of living in this country grew enormously up to World War I. Now, World War I involved all the major economic powers of the world to some extent, and most of them heavily. And as a result, the governments of these countries basically wrecked the institutional setup that I've been describing, which had developed over a century, or in some cases several centuries. I mentioned international trade. That was brought almost to a halt during the war because it was dangerous to engage in international trade. The way you see that is by going back and looking at the insurance rates. They shot up to many times what they had been before 1914. There were lots of merchant ships being sunk by the warring powers. And that's how people carried goods and services around international trade for the most part in those days. So trade was disrupted and reduced to a much lower level, and that in itself meant that the world was going to live at a lower level than it had before. But these governments didn't stop there. They conscripted millions of men to serve in the armed forces and took them away from productive employments and put them to work killing and destroying property. That wasn't good for the level of living either, not to mention the human spirit. And eventually they all engaged in what came to be called in those days war socialism, which is to say the governments either nationalized economic activities outright and put government officials in charge of managing them, or they imposed such severe regulations on private firms that they were in effect unable to do much other than what the government wanted them to do. So these government actions of taking over the economy and placing it in the service of war making wreaked havoc with the institutional developments of the previous century or more, and reduced the world's level of living tremendously. Incomes fell in all the major warring powers in Europe a great deal. And even in the United States, if we look at what happened to civilian goods and services, we find that it was definitely a case where guns were being obtained at the sacrifice of butter. People were living worse. You may have seen textbooks that dispute that, but they're wrong. And if you're interested in the evidence, I can give it to you. So war, as usual, was economically devastating, and in this case it was worse than that because it wrecked this wonderful institutional arrangement or set of arrangements that had so greatly facilitated progress. One of the things it wrecked was the international gold standard that had operated most successfully in the late 19th and early 20th century. This was the way that nations employed gold as a medium of exchange for making international transactions. You could go anywhere in the world, and if you had some gold money in your pocket, you were okay. You could do your business wherever you went because your gold money would trade at basically ounce for ounce against the gold money of other countries, at least those in the major trading world. So we had an international reliable medium of exchange. The governments all abandoned the gold standard except for the United States, which abandoned it only for international transactions. It kept it domestically. But all the other major economic powers abandoned it so that the governments could issue a lot of paper money and use that paper money to pay for soldiers and munitions. So the gold standard was abandoned, and in the 1920s, the world went through all kinds of troubles and gyrations in an attempt to put it back together. As it turns out, even though they made various attempts, what they recreated was never like the old gold standard. It was a different kind of arrangement that was much less tightly tied to gold and which did not constrain governments in the way that the old gold standard had. constrain them from issuing paper money. So this was an important upshot or consequence of World War I was destruction of the genuine gold standard and the creation of a lot of uncertainty about the international medium of exchange that would be used for trade and international finance. As part of the attempt to recreate the old gold standard, the Federal Reserve System in the United States, which you may remember was only created in December 1913 and didn't get going really until late 1914, which is to say just in time for World War I, had been used during the war by the government to help the government finance its war expenditures. And so the Fed was immediately perverted from what was supposed to be its task, which was smoothing out the business cycle and getting rid of severe financial panics, and placed at the service of the federal government to help it finance its war. But afterwards, the Fed occupied itself in part in trying to help the British return to the gold standard. And one of the things it did in that process was to engage in several spurts of easy money. That is, using open market operations, the Fed purchase of U.S. government securities to drive up their price and drive down the rate of interest on them so that securities would be less enticing in the United States and money would not flow out of Great Britain to the United States, making it more difficult for the British to return to the gold standard. The British made things hard on themselves by selecting the wrong rate of exchange between an ounce of gold and the pound sterling. They put too high a pound price on the gold, and therefore they overpriced their exports and made life hard for their export industries, and the result was a lot of unemployment in those industries. But the people who ran the U.S. Federal Reserve System and the people who ran the Bank of England were very tight. And so the Fed tried to help out the friends in England and created easy money along the way in several spurts. Now, as it turned out, that had a consequence. It didn't just have an effect on rates of international financial flows, but it also, by making interest rates lower in this country than they would have been if the market had been left alone, it encouraged various kinds of investments that wouldn't otherwise have seemed profitable. When you change the rate of interest, you change the present value of expected income flows from any investment stream. And the longer the term of that flow of income you expect from an investment stream, the greater effect a change in the interest rate has on it. So what happens when you lower the interest rate artificially, as the Fed did on several occasions in the 1920s, is you disproportionately encourage long-term investments. That's stuff like housing construction, office construction, building mines and ports and dams and all kinds of long-lived capital projects. Those things seem like better deals when the rate of interest is low than when the rate of interest is a little higher. So the Fed was having the effect by lowering interest rates in the 20s of bringing about what Austrian economists call malinvestment, the wrong kind of investment. Don't confuse that with too much investment. That's another matter. It may have done that too, but that's not my point here. The point is that it encouraged distortions in what the Americans were investing in and building up. Now, if it ever turns out that the Fed reverses itself and allows interest rates to rise from an artificially suppressed level, then what will happen is some of these bad investments will be seen to be bad. People will suddenly realize, hey, now when we think about these income streams in terms of a higher rate of interest, these look like money-losing investments. And they'll want to abandon some of them. And they will abandon some of them. And when they do, that means a certain volume of resources may be no longer demanded there and unemployed for a time while it finds a new outlet for its employment. So that monkeying with the interest rate, which is what modern monetary authorities do by design, is a recipe for bringing about misallocation of resources. Okay? It encourages people, when interest rates are artificially suppressed, to invest in projects that aren't really profitable, but are only made to appear profitable by the suppression of the interest rate. Well, later on, the Fed did change its mind, and that had important consequences because the Fed noticed that a lot of the new money that got created in this easy money episode was flowing into the stock market, driving up stock prices in what seemed to be an irrational or unsustainable way, especially in 1927, 28. And so the Fed officials decided they need to act to reverse this reduction of interest rates they'd previously brought about, and they did. At which point, we began to see the opposite. We began to see now with higher interest rates, a lot of malinvestments revealed as malinvestments, people starting to go bankrupt, and so forth. It didn't all happen at once. It took a while because whenever you use monetary policy, there are lags in the way it works its way through the economy. It takes sometimes more than a year, maybe 2 years on some occasions, for changes in monetary policy to work themselves through the economy and have their effects, but eventually they do. And one effect, of course, was the stock market crash of the fall of 1929. So this is just one of the threads you can follow to see how the war and the attempt to recreate the war-destroyed gold standard and the monetary policy all lead us up toward the onset of the Great Depression. I don't have time to tell all the stories that are similar to this, but there are a lot of others. Another thing that happened was a real estate boom, a construction boom. I've mentioned why that happened. That actually peaked about 1926, but when it started down, it didn't fall very rapidly. So that by 1929, construction activity in residential housing had only fallen about 15%. Now that's not to be sneezed at, that's substantial, but 15% is not the end of the world. Construction activity in commercial and industrial areas continued at a high level right up to the late 20s, and it didn't encounter its bust until 1929. A few of those projects are actually carried forward. One of the things you see is during boom times when monetary authorities are keeping interest rates artificially low, a lot of skyscrapers get built. That happened in this country in the 1920s. So people built the tallest buildings that had ever been built in this country, and they started the Empire State Building. And it wasn't finished when the bust came. They did go ahead and finish it in 1931, but for a long time, almost nobody wanted to rent space in it, and it just sat there losing money for over 10 years. So we had a construction boom, a real estate boom. Real estate prices were driven up, especially in certain parts of the country, such as Florida. Florida had just an unbelievable boom in real estate, and that was finally washed away, literally, 1926 by hurricane that came through the Miami area and destroyed a lot of the developments that had been built and some that were in the process of being built. And somehow it took the rose off people's desire to move to Florida for a while. And so the Florida bust happened very quickly. But the rest of the country didn't encounter its real estate bust quite so violently as Florida did, and hung on till 29. After 29, everything went to hell. There was virtually no real estate development to speak of for the next 10 years or more, actually until after World War II, because during the war you couldn't get the materials to build houses and apartments and so forth. That was all being used for military purposes. So we've got that development. We've got a bunch of financial gimmicks. Whenever you have easy money, malinvestments, construction booms, you always have financial gimmicks going along with it. And in the 20s, we had things like real estate trusts that were cooked up by wheeler dealers. Easy money attracts the criminal type. So if you ever feel the need to attract the criminal type, what you want to do is urge the Fed to lower interest rates. That'll do it every time. So some of these were not on the up and up. Some of them were. They just didn't work out. They weren't frauds. They just were bad ideas for the time. There were also holding companies that were created, and holding companies for holding companies. And I think there were even holding companies for holding companies that were holding companies. So this pyramiding of holding companies involved a whole bunch of companies. Only the one on the bottom owned any brick and mortar, any machines. The ones on top only owned shares in companies. Now you say, why would anybody want to do that? And the answer is because by pyramiding ownership claims like that, you could eventually be able, by owning shares in the topmost company, to control a huge volume of money at the lower levels. And that meant that with a relatively small investment, you could get a gigantic return. The leverage. Leverage is the key to paradise. Just ask anybody who's worked in Wall Street the last 2 years. Leverage, that's what everybody was trying to get between 2001 and 2006. Borrow money. Borrow money is cheap. We can all become billionaires. Right? Because we had new financial gimmicks this time, not holding companies or real estate trusts, but similar things. So let's back up and say what happened recently in these regards. Easy money. The Fed kept the interest rates very low between 2002 and 2005, extraordinarily low, especially if you adjust for inflation. They were almost zero. Even for things like mortgages, they were extremely low, corrected for inflation. And so, of course, a lot of real estate developments got started, and real estate prices got extremely high, especially in California and Florida and Nevada and Arizona and places that were already attractive to developers. So we got a real estate boom, construction boom in the early part of this century, and we got these financial gimmicks again. This time we got a whole bunch of mortgage-related derivatives, securities. There's securities that promise to pay some stream of income to people at a certain date, but they in turn got their incomes from the payments people made on mortgages when they bought homes. And again, these were pyramided, so that some people bought derivatives which were derivatives of derivatives. And again, why do you do this? Leverage. Leverage. A tiny amount of investment can get you a gigantic payoff. Only one thing has to happen. House prices have to rise forever. That's the one little fly in the ointment here. And for some reason, people in the early part of this century brought themselves to believe that house prices would increase forever. Now, if they had had any knowledge of history, they would have had trouble believing that, because house prices have gone through cycles for well over a century. It's one of the best documented cycles in all of economic histories, the real estate cycle. Prices go up and down, you know. You can always expect them to go down sooner or later. And this time it was sooner. And you see, once those house prices begin to fall, a lot of people find that they can't do what they thought, which was refinance their mortgage on good terms when the adjustable rate adjusts, or you know, when something else happens to make it hard for them to make their payments, and mortgage delinquencies start to rise, and pretty soon defaults are rising, and that's the whole source of nutrition for this mountain of derivatives. If people aren't paying in at the bottom, there's nothing to bulk up values at higher levels of this pyramid. And that pyramid started to crumble quite quickly toward the end of 2007, and then just fell utterly apart by the end of 2008. Not just here, by the way, but all over the world. And when that happened, all this money that had been pouring into the purchase of these derivative securities and being channeled into real estate purchases and encouraging developers meant that developments were seen to be no longer good bets. I found myself, strange to say, last spring on the southwest coast of Turkey. And that was odd. I've never been there in my life, but there I was. And of course, being an economist, I took note of certain things other than the usual touristy stuff. And one of the things I saw at one point driving along, actually riding the bus along, was one place where beautiful coastline, the Aegean Sea, just gorgeous there. I mean, magnificent place. If you ever have a chance to visit, I recommend it. But developers had come in there in the last few years and started building high-rise condos. These condos probably around 14, 16 stories each. And they had built, they must have built over 100 of these things. It just went on and on and on. But as I drove along last spring, in the wake of the financial debacle, what I saw was that almost all of them were standing there unfinished with no work going on. They've been abandoned. Their investors have given up on them. A few of them had a few tenants in the lower floors, and then all the upper floors unfinished, unoccupied. And I saw right before my eyes living proof of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. I said, here it is. Voila! I found this, the proof that Austrians have been seeking all these years, right here in Turkey. Bad real estate developments by the jillions, standing there, half-finished, abandoned. Now, at the time somebody started those, probably in 2003, 4, or 5, when they started gathering their investment money, that looked like a great deal. The world was getting rich. Everybody was making lots of money from investing in derivative securities, and stocks were rising, and life was lovely. So a lot of people were thinking, yeah, I'd like to have a condo on the Turkish coast. That'd be droll. And the investors were thinking, yeah, we'll take advantage of this. But you see, all this hinged on things that were made of air. They were made of air, eventually created by the sound of the Fed's computers as they rang up more and more bank deposits. The M2 definition of money grew about 2.5 times as fast as national output between 2001 and 2006. So money is plentiful. Money is easy. Interest rates are low. And it spills out onto the whole world, which to some extent goes along with the same kinds of stuff. So here we have similarities in the lead-up. We have some similarities in the bust as well. The U.S. market, of course, began to tank seriously last year, over a year ago, and has lost, well, at one point lost about half the value of the stock market or thereabouts, depending on which index you look at. So huge losses were sustained. I was reading something on the plane coming up here today about how by the end of last year, $8 trillion of losses had been sustained in the U.S. stock market alone. That's a lot of money. I know I lost some. Not that much, though. Not even my pro rata share, because thanks to my training in economics, I shifted into bonds early on. So I lost some money, but I didn't lose what these dreamers lost, who stayed with the stocks all the way down. Now, of course, back in the early 1930s, the stock market fell tremendously in late 1929, and then it started up again. Okay? And there occurred for about 4 or 5 months what has come to be known to historians as the suckers rally. Because there were all these happy-faced guys, like, it's hard to believe, but Herbert Hoover, who kept telling people, this was just a minor thing, it would pass, everything would be okay. And, the economic geniuses like Irving Fisher, the greatest economist ever produced in this country. Just ask anybody with a degree from the University of Chicago. They'll tell you. And Irving Fisher was a guy who was a millionaire. He had made, and he had proof in his pudding. Okay? He didn't just talk a good game, he got rich. And Irving Fisher was telling people, don't worry, this is just a small adjustment, this will pass. Fundamentals are sound. So some people took that kind of talk to heart and they started buying stocks again toward the end of 1929. And for the next 5 or 6 months, they bought stocks. Most of the losses went away. The stock market was made up more than half of its losses. Life is good. But not after that. Because the suckers market ended in the spring of 1930, stock market turned down again, and by the time it hit bottom in the summer of 1932, most of the U.S. stock indexes had fallen at least 85%. So this was not just a depression for poor people. Rich people took gigantic whacks as well. They lost tremendous wealth in the stock market and in other ways too on the way down. And as I was saying just a moment ago, the same thing has happened in recent years as investors in stocks and derivative securities of various kinds have lost their shirts and then some of their other garments as well. So there's a similarity. The difference, I think, that it's important to notice here is that in the Great Depression, the decline went on and on and on for years. It really lasted almost 4 years before things began to level out. And then they didn't improve very much after that. Some of the measures make it look as if things improved rapidly after 1933, but I admonish you to be careful in interpreting those indexes. They're tricky. Recently, we've had a decline in national product of about 4% from the second quarter of 2008 to the second quarter of 2009. We don't have the data yet for the third quarter. It probably isn't terribly different. So 4%, you know, you'd think that's not so much. Well, it was enough in a world geared to growth, assuming growth, making plans on the basis of growth. Having a 4% drop in national output makes a big difference. However, between 1929 and 1933, GDP fell by about 30%. 30%, okay? Recently, we've had hundreds of bank failures in this country, and other countries have had a number of bank failures. But between the beginning of 1930 and the end of 1933, we had 10,000 banks fail. 10,000. That was about 1/3 of all the commercial banks operating in this country before the crash. So we're not in that area at all yet. Well, the government took active measures then and recently to deal with these troubles, and some of the things that were done are similar and some are different. I would have to say that the Hoover administration did almost everything wrong. And that wouldn't have been so bad, except that Herbert Hoover was an activist, progressive president who believed that the government should intervene strongly to offset economic downturns. See, when the economy turned down sharply in 1920-21, the federal government was run by people who thought they should do nothing. And that's what they did. Basically, they did nothing. And that depression was over in about 2 years. Completely over. The unemployment rate in 1923 is only about 3%. 3%. 1921, it had been over 10%. It had been probably around 11, 12%. So this was a sharp but very short depression because prices fell greatly, and falling prices helped to reorganize an economy in contraction. Makes costs lower for people, tempts them to start up production again. Okay? Makes their money buy more. That's what we call the real balance effect in economics. Gives more purchasing power to the dollar than it had before prices fell. So all of these things helped, but the most important thing in 1921-22 is the fact that the government did nothing. But ever since 1929, when there's an economic downturn, governments have been doing something. And virtually everything they've done has, in my judgment, been for the worse. Hoover signed a tariff bill in mid-1930 that raised tariffs to the highest level in American history. And this was a high tariff country in the late 19th century. So that was saying something. Huge high tariffs. Other countries, even before this bill was signed, retaliated. And after it was signed, more retaliated. So we had a trade war. Okay? Think back to the 19th century. Economic progress, growing trade, growing division of labor, rising incomes. Now you've just turned that around by setting off a trade war in which every government tries to protect its own producers from competing imports by raising taxes on those imports. This is one of the most self-destructive measures any government can take, and it's one that every government finds itself pressed to make when economic contraction takes place. The current government is finding itself pressed now in this country, and it's unfortunately begun to respond to those pressures. The government raised tariffs recently on tires imported from China. Of course, the Chinese turned around and raised tariffs on on American poultry imported into China, and so it goes. And we can only hope it is curtailed before it becomes as destructive as the tariff war of the early 1930s. So that was a very bad move by Hoover, but it was not the worst. Even worse was the fact that Hoover was a great believer in a kind of crude purchasing power theory of the macroeconomy. He thought that the economy worked best if wages were kept high because the workers earned a lot of money and then they would turn around and spend it. And that would keep the producers' mills running. Well, this was a very primitive way to think about how the economy operates and a very destructive one. Because what was happening in the early 1930s, actually starting in late 1929, was that demands were falling for a whole range of goods and services. And that meant that the derived demand for labor to produce those goods and services was also falling. So the normal effect of that fall in demand for labor would have been a reduction in the prevailing rate of market wages. But Hoover got together some of the leading employers in the country in November and December of 1929 in big conferences. He brought in labor unions, he brought in farm organizations, and he got these people to sign on to his plan, which was, whatever you do, do not cut wages any faster than the cost of living falls. In other words, don't cut real wages. But real wages is what you have to cut to re-equilibrate the labor market. That's the price in the labor market, is the real wage. Unfortunately, a lot of these people, whether out of a desire to please Hoover or go along with him or for other reasons, that's still an actively debated question in economic history, for whatever reason, many employers, especially in durable goods industries, where demand was falling fastest, did not cut real wages. In fact, they cut money wages so little that real wages actually went up, as their workers were finding that they could buy more with their earnings than they had before. But the necessary consequence of rising real wages when the demand was falling for labor was a gigantic amount of unemployment. So unemployment began to grow quickly in 1930. And it was already quite high by the end of 1930, and then it got worse and worse and worse until when we got to the beginning of 1933, almost 25% of the labor force seeking work was totally out of a job, and another 25% was involuntarily working at reduced hours. Spreading the work was all the rage in those days, both as a government policy and often as just an employer policy to try to keep some income going to the workers. So we've got half of the workforce that's not fully employed at that point, half of the workforce, and in some places where the workforce was heavily occupied in the production of durable goods, you know, the kind that goes into long-term projects, which weren't happening anymore. Unemployment rates were 60 or 70%. You go back and look at some place like Youngstown, Ohio. Look at Pittsburgh. Look at any of the big industrial labor markets of the North and the Northeast, where manufacturing durable industrial goods was a concentration there. Those workers were in deep trouble. If you came out of college in 1929 and started looking for work, there was some fair chance you'd never get a real job for the next 10 years, even if you had a good education. Because as unemployment got higher and higher, an employer didn't have to hire a young person. They could hire somebody with experience for the same pay. And they did. So a lot of young people just had to fritz around, make do odd jobs, go to school when they didn't really want to go to school, and so forth. Rely on their parents, rely on relatives, rely on friends, knock around. That's how a lot of people got by. They scrapped. They had to scrap in the 1930s. Lots of people were living on practically nothing. My father, who was a young man in those days, never went without work for long, but that's because he would do things like work all day cutting a cord of wood for $1. That's a lot of wood to split for $1. I grant you, $1 bought more in those days, but nonetheless, a lot of work for a little pay. And at one point, my family actually moved to Arizona looking for work picking cotton, where cotton farms were being developed out around the Phoenix area. Think of that. Moving from godforsaken Oklahoma to godforsaken Arizona to pick cotton. And not for much money either. But, that's what you had to do if you insisted on working. Now, as it turned out, the government made it possible for some people to get income without insisting on working because it came up with a lot of relief measures, particularly after Roosevelt took office in March 1933, that provided income to millions of people. And when you add in all their family members, to tens of millions of people at one time or another for make-work jobs or for sometimes they were okay jobs. It's just that who knew if they were worth anything? They were jobs selected by politicians and government bureaucrats. You have no way to know without a market whether something has value or not. So people built sidewalks and they built new post offices, and artists painted murals in those post offices, and actors put on plays paid for by the government, and it went on and on. There was just a tremendous effort to put people to work, but a great deal of it was make work. It's work that never would have happened had the situation been different. So it's hard to say what was really accomplished other than giving some people a few dollars worth of earnings. It made a lot of people grateful, I'll say. To this day, you can find old fellas who were in the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a government program created in 1933 to put young men into semi-military units and send them out in the country, the woods, the deserts, to build trails in parks and to build fire breaks and so forth. And a lot of these old CCC boys just love the CCC. They're now in their 80s and 90s. They think it saved their life. And in the circumstances, they got an argument. It's just that those circumstances didn't have to exist had it not been for the government policies being enacted and implemented at that time. It's it's not all that compassionate to create conditions in which people are starving and then pass among them, giving them little tidbits to eat. So that's the situation here. We had a lot of government activity under Hoover, including big tax increases, creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which interestingly did some of the things the government has done recently. For example, in an attempt to help out banks and insurance companies and other financial firms, it purchased preferred shares, which is exactly what the U.S. government has done under the so-called TARP, the Troubled Assets Relief Plan, which was created to buy worthless assets from banks, but wasn't used for that purpose. And instead it was used to give money straight to banks for preferred shares, or to give it to General Motors or to Chrysler or to AIG, the big insurance company, and to other people. But don't lose hope, my friends. Don't think that the government misled you when they said the world will go to hell unless Congress approves this TARP program by October 3rd last year, which they did, because they're going to use it to buy some toxic assets. And the program is starting to gear up now. I read an article just this morning. By the end of the month, it will be in operation, and the government will be putting $3 billion into this program to relieve banks of troubled assets. The banks are estimated to hold in this country something in excess of $1.4 trillion worth of these so-called toxic assets. So if you do the arithmetic, what you see is that this marvelous government program, which took over a year to get going, is going to purchase about 2/3 of 1% of those nasty assets and take them off the hands of those banks at prices they could never get in a free market, and reward all the wheeler dealers that are running the program with lavish fees. It almost makes you think there's hanky-panky afoot here sometimes, but maybe I'm just a terrible cynic. I've been accused of that. Now, what happened last September can only be described as panic. I happened to be traveling during part of that period, and so I was in hotel rooms equipped with televisions. Now, I have a TV at home, it's just that I don't watch it. And so I miss a lot of things that the rest of the world sees. I watch only Seattle Mariner baseball games because I'm an economist and I believe in specialization. So that's how I use my TV. But last September, traveling, I was in these hotel rooms with a TV, and I turned it on, and I found these financial channels full of barking dogs. Well, actually, they were not dogs, they were human beings. They were yapping and yelping and barking about impending doom, and I'd never heard the like of it before. You'd have programs with 4 or 5 people on at once, all barking simultaneously. I didn't, I was tempted to think the world had gone to the dogs. But it was clear that everybody had lost his composure the last week of September last year. And they'd interview Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, and he would bark a little bit. And they would talk to Ben Bernanke, and he would bark. And so, the whole world was barking like my little dachshund puppy when she's frightened. She really squeals. You think she's going to be eaten by a giant condor or something. That's the way the government was yelping last September. And I don't expect you to take my word for this, so I actually brought along an expert to quote here. And this is a quotation from a congressman. It happens to be one you've probably heard of, Ron Paul, who wrote a few days after the bailout bill was passed on October 3rd, the rallying cry heard all over the Hill the past 2 weeks was that Congress must act. Our economy is facing a meltdown. Okay? Now, for those of you who've been going to classes learning that an economy is a whole lot of transactions and arrangements that people make with one another, not at all like the fuel pile of a nuclear reactor. Well, get over that, because our economy is facing a meltdown. A lot of people use that metaphor. Other people, strangely enough, said it was freezing up. I spent several weeks doing research on whether it was getting cold or hot. But anyhow, it was melting down and freezing up all at once. Would this bill fix it? Nobody could really explain how it would. In fact, few demonstrated any real understanding of credit markets, of derivatives, of credit default swaps, or mortgage-backed securities. If they did, they would have known better than to vote for this bill. All they knew was that this administration was saying some frightening things and asking for a lot of money. So they got their $700 bailout bill, which, as I say, after a year, they're going to use to acquire a tiny, tiny fraction of toxic assets now held by banks and other financial institutions. So that's the government we rely on to take care of us in troubled times. There was a lot of ebb and flow in both of these meltdowns. And a lot of it had to do on both occasions with the quality of the economic analysis people were bringing to bear. And when I say that, I don't mean just ordinary people. We don't expect them to be very knowledgeable about economic analysis. That's not what they do. They have other jobs. But I include also professional economists who I would have to say on both of these occasions acquitted themselves most disgracefully. Horribly, in fact. An article was written last January in the New York Times by a reporter who had gone to the meetings of the American Economic Association. And he wrote about what the people were saying there. What are these economists saying in their presentations they make, and what do they tell you when you interview them out in the corridors? And basically what they were saying was what I call vulgar Keynesianism. This is the level of macroeconomic understanding circa 1949. What you would get if you read the first edition of Samuelson's textbook, Economics. Maybe not quite that good, actually. Ground had been lost, it seems. Here we had the professional economists of the United States, the premier economists of the world. People come from all over the world to study economics in this country. And I say to them, don't bother, okay? Go home. There may be a few places where you can learn something, but damn few. This happens to be one of them, by the way, so if you're a student here, luck serves you well. You landed in a place where you can learn some real economics, but in most places you won't. You'll learn this crackpot stuff. Now, back in 1929, 30, 31, there were some good economists, just as there are now some GMU economists that know which end is up, but not very many. And there are all kinds of crackpot ideas floating around and being used as the basis for important public policies. There was a professor at Cornell. His name was Warren. And all economic historians love this guy Warren, because Warren and another guy named Pearson cooked up a price index at a time when we didn't have a long price index. And, that's a big help in doing economic history, to have some idea what was happening to the general run of prices over time. So Warren and Pearson, heroes. But Warren was a nutty economist. He was pretty good at collecting price data and making them into index numbers. But he got the idea that the way to get out of the Depression was by raising prices. See, prices had fallen so much in the early 1930s, 25 to 30%, depending on which prices you look at. So he said, if we can only get prices back up again, and this, by the way, was probably the most widely accepted idea of the early 30s. If only we can have reflation. If we can get prices back up again, all will be well. So Warren came in and he sold President Roosevelt on the idea that we should get prices up. Roosevelt already believed that. He was easy on that. But the way to do it, Warren said, it's easy. I have, from my studies of prices, determined that there's a virtually perfect correlation between the price of gold and the price of other commodities. So if you just unhinge the Treasury from the gold standard, and so instead of giving everybody $20.67 in exchange for an ounce of gold, give them more. Give them a higher dollar price for their gold. Gold prices will rise, and the United States has such a big part of the world's gold stock that we can do this. We can finagle the world price of gold, drive it up, and the result will be we'll lift ourselves out of the Depression. And Roosevelt thought this sounded cool. He says, yeah, let's do that. So that's what the United States government did. They got the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, created under Hoover in 1932, which continued to be the major spending and lending agency under the New Deal. And the RFC undertook to start going into the gold market and buying gold, offering a little more each day to jack the price up. Every day, they decide how much to jack it up by coming in at breakfast time and checking with Roosevelt. Well, Mr. President, how much do you want the price up today? One time, according to Morgenthau, the Treasury Secretary, Roosevelt's lying in bed still. He did a lot of stuff in bed in the morning, and he said, 21 cents today. He said, well, exactly 21? Yes, 21 cents. Well, why, Mr. President? Why 21 cents? He says, because that's a lucky number. Think about this. This is the President of the United States in the process of wrecking the gold standard, and he's doing it on the basis of silly, childish nonsense. And that's how the world was ruled and led to catastrophe. Not just that way, but in dozens, hundreds of government policies, counterproductive, destructive, tearing apart the price system, substituting bureaucratic decisions for the decisions made by millions of decentralized decision makers with knowledge of their local circumstances that nobody in Washington could know or cared to know. So, unfortunately, the government did something. It did a lot. It, as Roosevelt liked to say, try something. If things are in bad shape, try something. Like, what? Anything. Try it. Because if it doesn't work, then try something else. That was Roosevelt's formula. This was a formula for blind flailing. Because every crackpot with an idea that waltzed into Washington or had a lobbyist with any clout managed to get his program put into law. And pretty soon you had an economy so messed up by crackpot policies that it was just a gigantic tangle of unproductiveness. The wonder is that this economy ever recovered at all, that it didn't just dissolve into a mass of poverty and death. Because the government can do that. It can do it. It's done it before in different places. The government of Zimbabwe killed a big number of people in that country recently by bad economic policy. It's doable. We'll give it another try now, I guess. Because lately, I'm sorry to say, economic policy has not been much more intelligent than it was back in the early 1930s. The Federal Reserve System has undertaken, out of what appears to be stark panic, to inject itself not just into the market for U.S. government securities, where it historically undertook its so-called open market operations to influence short-term interest rates, but it has undertaken to inject itself into a gigantic variety of financial and credit markets. It'll go out and buy securities from commercial paper dealers, from securities dealers, from People that make student loans, oh, I should let them off on that, I guess. Car loans, loans to buy guns and ammo. I think that was a slip-up, actually, but it happened. So, you know, the Fed has undertaken these huge number of programs. I mean, I don't even know how many they've done. I've been looking for compilations for months, so I get a kind of encyclopedic collection of what the Fed has done. I keep finding new ones that I didn't know about before. I mean, they're everywhere. They're everywhere. So the Fed used to own these multi-billions of dollars worth of U.S. government securities. That was the asset side of its portfolio, so-called. Now they've given away or sold most of those U.S. government securities, and instead they've purchased to replace them and add enormously to them in nominal value all these junk bonds of various sorts. Crappy securities, toxic things. Ooh, don't touch those securities. They're poison. That's another odd metaphor, isn't it? Toxic securities. I can understand if a security is worthless. Yeah, that's how we normally think about securities. What price will they fetch? But toxic? My goodness, that sounds horrible. One of the things I enjoy in my spare time is metaphors. So I spend a lot of time looking at political lingo and economic policy-making lingo because it's all used to engage the emotions and to distort people's thinking about substantive matters. And you can learn a lot from looking at the terms people choose to express themselves in this area. But the Fed, as a result of acquiring all these junk securities, it's built up bank reserves to a level more than twice as great as they were last August of 2008. It did that in 5 months' time. Between August 2008 and January of 2009, the Fed more than doubled the monetary base of the United States. Okay? What had taken over 2 centuries to build was doubled in 5 months. Hey, the sky's the limit, right? And in fact, they're still talking about doing more along those lines. Right now, they're having those talks, thinking about new programs for the Fed to go out and be the lender of first resort. Because think about this. If you're selling crappy securities, do you want a low price in the market or do you want a high price from the Fed? That's a no-brainer. And so a lot of people, having enough brains, you know, not to get themselves into this trouble, that's true. They weren't that smart. But having enough brains to see that getting something for nothing from the Federal Reserve System is still worth doing, are doing it. And these so-called toxic securities, which the government says are clogging up the markets because nobody knows their value. Well, how would anybody find out their value? If everybody has a perfect incentive to sit waiting for the government to buy them for vastly more than they're actually worth. They got that much of an idea of what they're worth. Okay? And you tell me all those MIT PhDs can't figure out what these derivatives are worth? Nonsense. They told us all about these securities before. They're the ones that built all these derivatives, credit default swaps and the rest of us. And they built them in such a way that they could not fail. Well, they just forgot 1 or 2 things, I guess. But anyhow, these are bright guys. They could figure out how much to bid for securities. But they're not doing it because everybody's waiting to be bailed out for the government. And the government has proven that it stands ready to bail out anybody and everybody with a lobbyist. With a lobbyist. One of the bright spots I've read about in the recent economy is upscale hotels in Washington, D.C. You know, those places the lobbyists occupy. They've been doing grand in the last 6 months. Okay? Hard to get in there. It's cheek by jowl with those guys. So we've got a lot of nonsense floating around and a lot of bad policy being done in response. Sometimes you have to decide when you think about government policy. Your choices are fools or charlatans. Okay? And I'm often drawn actually to the idea that it's both. That you don't really have to choose. That yes, the people who make these policies are charlatans. I don't think it's total coincidence that Goldman Sachs has come out of this mess smelling like a rose. Call me a suspicious guy. I don't think that's a total accident. I think charlatanism is alive and well in our policy making. But at the same time, I think they're fools also. Even if they weren't charlatans, I think they'd screw up. Because how can they know? These are human beings, fallible as anybody else, trying to substitute their decisions, their judgment, and their knowledge for the decisions, judgment, and knowledge of millions of well-placed people scattered around the world, interacting through decentralized markets. Human beings can't substitute for that. It's the fatal conceit, to borrow the term from Hayek. It's the fatal conceit. Fatal's the right adjective, too. It can kill. It has killed. That conceit killed millions, hundreds of millions in the 20th century alone, as tyrannical governments tried to substitute their bureaucratic judgments for the market. The body count is enormous. It can be added to. All we have to do is turn to the state and beg for its salvation. And believe me, everybody's ready to do that, with only a handful of exceptions. So this is sort of where we are. Now, one upshot of this is what I mentioned earlier, regime uncertainty. Regime uncertainty is the name I gave to the situation that arose in the 1930s, particularly from 1935 on, because at that point, Roosevelt decided that his political fortunes would be best served if he fomented class warfare, more so than he had already. So he, under the influence of advisors like Tom Corcoran and Ben Cohen and James Landis and other people, he began to threaten, to demagogue, to invite, as he put it, the hatred of the princes of property, the economic royalists, his terms, not mine. Okay? He attacked the entire investor class. Now, was that a smooth move? Politically, yes. In 1936, after he had done this for a year and a half or so, he was reelected by a gigantic margin. The opponent won only 2 states in the Electoral College, and they were little ones. Okay? So, yeah, astute politics, but what was the economic consequence of stirring up this kind of uncertainty about where the world was headed with regard to private property rights? The consequence was that practically no long-term investment was made for the whole 10 years of the Great Depression and more. If you're going to make an investment, it better have a short-term payoff. Otherwise, you might find yourself caught when the country goes full-out fascist or socialist. Because the way Roosevelt was talking, it might not be very long before you got there. And there are a lot of different ways, I've produced some of them in my research, to show that this was serious. This wasn't just talk on the part of the plutocrats. You know, historians tend to dismiss this and say, oh, these are Republican plutocrats. What do you think they'd say? But look at where they put their money. Okay? That tells you a lot. And if you look at that, what you see is they were very frightened, extremely frightened. And their fright didn't really get over until the war came along and turned the economy into a centrally controlled war state for 5 years. And then when the war ended and the war controls came off for the most part, once again, these investors were willing to come out, Roosevelt dead, New Deal in retreat, and make long-term investments. So the economy prospered at that point. What we're seeing right now has the potential to generate a substantial degree of regime uncertainty. It's not at the level that we were in the early 1930s at all, but there's enough uncertainty, particularly with these nationalizations. The government has nationalized, in part, 600 or 700 commercial banks. It's taken over AIG, the biggest insurance company in the world. It's taken over Fannie and Freddie, financial institutions which which at the end of the real estate boom were either holding or guaranteeing more than half of all residential mortgage securities in the United States. Now, Fannie and Freddie and these other government lenders are virtually only people lending for mortgages. So if you've got the government running the commercial banks by virtue of being a giant owner, running the real estate investment industry by virtue of being the only secondary market for mortgages, running indirectly through partial ownership General Motors and Chrysler, and acquiring common stocks right and left when it turns out that loans they make to companies can't be repaid. They just say, well, forget it. You owe us $1 trillion, we'll just say that we own $1 trillion worth of your common shares. Well, that sort of wipes out the existing shareholders by diluting their shares, of course, but what can these companies say? They're up against it. So, you know, they will be easy marks for these government promises of salvation. But in doing this, the government puts itself in a position to be genuinely menacing about the future of the private property rights in this country. They were already extremely damaged from decades of government assault, but now they're under especially heavy assault. And so we've seen many different people even talking about this and talking about the moral hazard that the government has created by standing ready to bail out anybody and everybody. I even have a quotation from the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, of all people, one of the best statements I've seen about the role of moral hazard. And what he says, his name is Charles Plosser. He says, this crisis, whether it's because of the Fed or the Treasury or Congress, has created a lot of new moral hazard. Once you have done this once, even though it was in a severe crisis, the temptation will be for people to figure out that in the next crisis, you'll do it again. And in fact, much of the trouble that the big banks got themselves in this time around was precisely because they were already working on moral hazard. They were already counting on a bailout if things got bad. And we can't fault them for that because now we see they were right. Okay? That means there's no downside risk. Go for the moon, shoot the moon. Go for buying investments with a high payoff but high risk. Because if they don't work out, well, you're not going to lose anything. The taxpayers will pick it up. But if it does work out, you become fabulously rich yourself. It goes right in your wallet. We've privatized the profit and socialized the risk. What a wonderful world for corporate charlatans with friends in high places. And you got to add that. It's no good to just be a corporate charlatan without friends in high places in the government, because only the government can come in, create money out of thin air, and bail out anybody and everybody. But this has put us in a situation where there's real doubt about what the future of our economic system will be. I hope a lot of this goes away. Government officials keep saying they have no intention of permanently keeping these policies in place. They know the loans are going to be repaid, blah, blah, blah. Don't believe it. Many of these loans cannot be repaid, so they're not going to be paid. That's one sure law of social science. People will never do what they can't do. Okay? And a lot of these loans can't be repaid, so they won't be, and that means they're going to be losses to the taxpayers. And for what? For keeping zombie firms going for years on end, looking as if they're not bankrupt when they've been bankrupt all along. Ben Bernanke has treated this crisis as a liquidity crisis. He thinks it's just like the early 30s when we were having these bank runs and we had no deposit insurance, and so a bank run would set off a cascade of other bank runs, and pretty soon perfectly good banks were made insolvent. But it hasn't been a liquidity crisis. That's a misrepresentation. It's been an insolvency crisis. It's been the bust from a lot of malinvestments at high places in the financial industry. And because they were at high places, the government came along to bail out its buddies. And they did. But now we've got firms that are walking dead Talking dead. You think Bank of America is a solvent institution? You think Citigroup's solvent? Go down the list. I don't think so. They just haven't yet owned up to how little some of their assets is really worth. So that's that. Well, maybe we have time for some questions at this point. I'm sorry I talked so long.
Yeah, I think your presentation was fantastic, but I think a lot of people that would play devil's advocate might say to you that during World War II or during some periods of the New Deal, there was great growth as far as GDP and index numbers of those sort go. So I was hoping you could give a response that I know I've seen before in your writings to this kind of accusation.
Right. Well, the GDP did grow between 1933 and 1937 when it turned down again and lost about 2 years worth of growth in that interior depression of 37, 38. So I'm not saying there was no growth in the early New Deal. There was some growth, but it's hard to know how much it was because a good deal of it was the government purchase of final goods and services. And we don't know what those are worth. Those aren't real market goods and services, so we have no way to know. We may think we know. We may say, well, if a guy is working for the government and getting paid $3 a day, and similar guys are working for private firms in the area, and they're getting $3 a day, well, that's a good price. That's what we should credit here, the government adding to the income stream, $3. But we're not entitled to make that inference. That's just a leap. We don't have any way to know what things are worth when the government buys them. Now, where that really comes into play in full force is during the war, because during the war it looks as if, depending on which set of Commerce Department stats you look at, anywhere from 60 to 90% increase in GDP. Between 1941 and 1944 at the peak. If you break that down and say, what was it? What was causing this increase? What you find is that during that time, the civilian goods and services fell. And all of the increase and then some in GDP was government purchases of war-related goods, all of it, and then some. So private investment fell as much in the early 1940s as it had in the early 1930s. It almost disappeared. On net, it did disappear. Private consumption fell substantially in 1942, 43. And it may have recovered a little bit, but still didn't get up to the 1941 level until the war was over. Only growth that took place during the war is this phony growth of government spending for bombers and soldiers' pay and the rest of it. So what was that worth? Well, the way the accounts are kept, it's worth whatever the government paid for it. That's to say, it has no rational basis. It has no basis in the same kinds of trade-offs made when you or I go out and pay $1 for something. That's our way of saying this thing is worth more than something we could get with the dollar somewhere else, okay? So we need to add $1 to total value being created by whoever sold us that final good or service, okay? But when somebody in the War Department decides how much to pay the Boeing company for a B-29 bomber, all we know is that some bureaucrats and some corporate executives and some guys in other war agencies cooked up a number and handed this money to Boeing. That's all there is. There's no economic rationality there whatsoever because it wasn't their money. Okay? That's the key. That's the key. The only reason price system reveals valuations is that it's an indirect way of revealing the trades people are voluntarily willing to make. And when you get into government pricing, You've left that world. These aren't prices people are voluntarily willing to make. They're not making the trades. They're just putting down numbers that they think they can get by with that'll help them in their careers, or, you know, set them up for a career later working for the Boeing company. It happens. It's happened thousands of times. I didn't invent it. Yes?
Yes, why do you think the stock market didn't crash until the fall, until September of 2008? Housing prices peaked in 2006. By early 2007, subprime problems were apparent. There was anecdotal evidence. I went to Miami on business in May of 2007, and just driving from the airport downtown and looking at the condo building in downtown Miami, you immediately go, oh my God, there's a problem here.
Right.
Yet the stock market kept on going, peaked on October 9, at least the Dow did, October 9, 2007, and then we go practically a whole nother year before the stock market crashes. Why do you think it took so long for the stock market to crash? And also, do you think energy prices played a role in that? We had very high energy prices earlier on in 2008.
Well, I think, you know, trying to explain the stock market short-term movements is like reading tea leaves, or, you know, the entrails of lizards or something. I don't know is the short answer. I don't know why that happened. I have some speculations I could offer you. The main one would be that many people had believed what they had been told for years, which was that the real estate market was largely immune from serious depression. Okay? The storyline for years had been that real estate declines only in spot markets. So yeah, real estate might be in trouble in Florida, or it might be in trouble in the Bay Area in California or somewhere else. But, you know, the overall U.S. real estate market was sound because they'd tell you, you know, the population's growing and income's growing and families are being formed and blah, blah, blah. Well, you know, Greenspan's distributed this story himself on many occasions. People looked to gurus like that. For a long time, Greenspan's word was like the word of God. So a lot of people were reassured by what seemed to be authoritative judgments that real estate could not fall into a general crash. And if it didn't, then the stock market was not so loony to keep rising. But it did, and so when the stock market finally recognized that it had, it reflected that real estate trouble. But, you know, why it took as long as it did, I have no idea. I think, you know, a lot of people buy and sell shares on you know, when I surf around the web looking at people who give advice on stocks, I'm appalled. I mean, this is just egregious nonsense and obvious nonsense in most cases. People are nutty. I don't know why anybody follows them or pays for this stuff or puts up with it, but it's out there. So the stock market's full of a lot of loony stuff. Although, you know, economists for years said it's efficient markets, blah, blah, blah. Every scrap of good information is incorporated instantly into the stock price. That's crazy. It wasn't like that. But I don't really know why it took precisely that long. A lot of things have to get people's attention, and I think that credit crunch, so-called, last September got everybody's attention in a violent way. And from that point on, you're almost whatever the government did. If the government didn't do anything, the stock market fell. If it did something, it fell. Well, it was half right.
We have time for one more.
Okay, here's a question in the front. The middle.
Hi, thanks for coming out. My name is Jason Ahrens. I'm a graduate student here in economics. I'm actually teaching the Econ 100 course this semester.
Mm-hmm.
One of the boogeymen of macroeconomics that we talk about sometimes is the downward spiral of deflation.
Yeah.
Right? But you just gave an example, I think, of at least one, maybe multiple times when deflation did show up, and we discovered, lo and behold, the equilibrium point was not absolute zero, that at some point it adjusted back out.
Right.
So my question to you is, do you think that boogeyman is real? Is that something we should be afraid of? Or do you think that, no, generally speaking, deflation readjusts, but it's always going to, that is not going to just fall off a cliff?
I think the mainstream economics profession has a phobia about deflation that is irrational. Because most economists think you should never have any deflation ever for any reason, and that's clearly wrong. We had long-run in deflation in the United States from 1865 to 1898. Almost every year the price level fell, and that was a period of most rapid growth of overall GDP in our history. GDP grew about 4% per annum on average. So we had very rapid economic growth with secular deflation. Now, so deflation can be fine if it's slow enough and if it's the product of growing productivity. Okay? But I think if deflation is rapid and it's the product of sudden monetary shocks, then it can be disruptive and harmful. And I think there probably was harm being done in the early 1930s by rapid, substantial, monetary shock-induced deflation. And by the way, what the Fed did then, the monetarists all blamed the Fed for that by saying that it should have taken more active measures to keep that from happening. But the Fed was actually taking positive measures. It was always acting, adding to its portfolio, injecting funds. It's just that it wasn't nearly doing it fast enough, except for one period in mid-1932, to outrun the fact that there was an ongoing large increase in the demand to hold currency rather than bank deposits, which reduced the money multiplier and kept the deflation going. And all these bank failures encouraged the people to withdraw their money and to use cash instead of bank deposits. So I think there was a situation then, and that's where, by the way, I part company with at least some of my Austrian friends who poo-poo this and think, oh, the more deflation, the better. I don't believe that. I think this secondary deflation that some economists have discussed, including, by the way, Irving Fisher, who I believe coined the phrase, can do harm. Gottfried Habler, who wrote one of the most interesting analyses of the Great Depression, very much believed that secondary deflation had been harmful in the early 30s, and I'm tempted to agree with him. I don't want, however, to represent myself as an authority on this question. I would suggest you take it up with Larry White, who's on the faculty here at GMU, or some of the others who are more authoritative on that matter than I am. Okay, thank you very much for coming.